continue your.
I'm not sure I
Yeah.
start it quite with such a wonderfully positive high note.
Yes.
I would say that's completely ironic because it's really not positive to talk about.
How do I? Let's see.
Now you're side by side. You look fine. That's how it looks. That's how I looked from my whole thing.
Yeah, I was wondering. I was asking myself whether you had it or not. Let me post on our socials. This is gonna be
it's not
painstakingly long, by the way.
It's all right. Paula cannot get in on the browser. She has to download the app.
Yes.
And the app is a computer killer.
Yes.
So, like, it violently murders her laptop every time she's ever tried to use it.
It's not brilliant. I'll say that. Let me post the story on our socials.
I thought you were about to say, what's the story in Balamori? And I'm just like, that show has not existed in a long time.
What's is the timer going up for you on the right, left? No, on the left top corner.
I don't have a timer. I've got a series of lines.
Yeah, I've got that as well, which is strange. Is Paula?
I'll ask her.
Yeah, because if she's hearing us, then.
Can you?
Oh, one not indeed. Okay. I think we're live. I'm
asking the big question. Can you hear us? Yes, you can.
Do you see what I see? Do you hear what I? Anyway, how's your day?
How's my day been? I almost missed. So histology has this thing, right, where we have the practical labs. It's not an actual lab practical though. It's online and it's using the virtual microscope. If you've ever used that before, and
I have not.
We have it for 2 hours, and then for 15 minutes after the practical is ended, you can access the quiz associated with the practical. So it's only open till 12:15. So of course I phoned my GP for a phone back at about 10 in the morning, and of course he phoned back at fucking 12. And I was like, oh no, I got it done. And then I had to take the 5 minutes extra time because I just ran out of time, and it lets you take 5 extra minutes, but it penalizes you for it. So I think I've done really badly, or I've done really well and I've lost a couple of marks just because I had to take the extra time. But I needed the extra time. I couldn't answer all the questions.
Why didn't you say to your GP?
I did. That's why I spoke to him at such a breakneck speed. And he spoke back to me at a breakneck speed. It was great.
Wait. Well, why didn't you say to him, you know, I'm in the middle of an assessment, please call me? I
haven't actually started the assessment yet.
Oh, okay.
So I'd got to the point where I'd put in the access codes and I was about to go, and then my phone went, and I was like,
yeah, it's always there's confirmation bias though, because we think it's always in those moments when the phone rings. It's confirmation bias, isn't it?
It's what usually happens in my life is I'll phone the GP at 8 in the morning, and it'll be about 4:45, and I'm thinking, oh, for God's sake, or it'll be like 5 o'clock or something, and I'm thinking, right, they have to phone eventually. But then I really need to go to the bathroom, so I go to the bathroom and they fucking phone instantly in the bathroom, and it's happened about 4 times now, and I think they have some sort of way of responding. Yes. Our patients are currently in a compromised state. Let's phone them. Would not be surprised if that's how they run.
I highly doubt it's some kind of not the 6th sense, but the 7th sense. where they just have a feeling. You know what I mean? This is the perfect moment to
Yeah, I
get
was
them
saying
to
it should be the 8th sense, because the 7th sense used to be when one of my old ex-friends from Cyprus, he would be in Cyprus, I would be in Scotland, and we would both message each other roughly at the exact same time without any prior sort of nudge, as to say, I'm going out for a cigarette, do you want to have a phone call? Every time. And it was some weird psychological thing where it just sort of like, as like, right, the amount of time that usually passes before I go outside is now gone by. So it's time to go outside and freeze my arse off.
Oh, my mum. I need to call my mum.
It's still saying we have dash dash colon dash dash.
I know. Which I don't exactly understand. I hope it's recording.
Yeah, so do I.
No, does it? Can I?
It never said, and I still don't know how you found the recordings. But I'm eternally grateful that you did, because
I do not know how exactly I do it. Can I?
Because you can just shamelessly plug the society when we upload it to YouTube.
Can I? I cannot. Only do.
So yeah, Paula can see everything that we can see.
One way. Give me a second, cat. Just calling my mum.
I just want to make it clear to anybody who's joining, that is André on the phone to his mother, and we're live. I love this so much.
I am back. My
sorry,
apologies.
it's just having a little giggle about that. The fact that you're like, I need to phone my mother. Goodbye.
It's because my mum gets worried if I don't call.
Who does mine? It's that mine's more if I don't text.
I could text my mum, to be fair.
She always jumps to the worst conclusion. And, I mean, she's not exactly wrong, because I mean, yes, one of her biggest fears is apparently me falling over or something in my flat and nobody knows, and I knock myself out, and you know.
Did that happen recently?
I didn't knock myself out, but I fell out of the shower because I'm a smart genius whose talents know no bounds. I don't know how I did it. It was quite painful. I've got a really, really massive bruise on my back and another huge one on my leg. Anyway, I phoned my mum, and I'm just like, I am such a genius. And whenever I start a conversation like that, she knows that I've broken something's broken. Something's gone terribly wrong somewhere. And she's like, what have you done? And I'm just like, I fell out the shower. And she's just like, really? Like, really? Are you okay? Did you hit your head? No. Really? Like that might be the worst fear recognised, and it was actually totally fine. So
right. So for those who are watching, we should be starting sometime soon, in about a couple of minutes. We just, you know, as a someone from Portugal and someone who is always late for everything, I tend to always start things late for people like me who are always late.
You take the Dundee University online lecture approach. We understand.
Yeah, I guess
It's yeah.
I'm no, it's just if it was me on the other side, I would appreciate it. So it's the old don't do to other to you know what I mean, don't do to others
Hmm.
that which you wouldn't like to be done to you.
Hmm.
Yeah, something like that. I know that sentence in Portuguese, but translating it is weird.
Do unto others how you would do unto yourself. It's probably
Right.
terribly wrong.
Treat others like you'd like to be treated.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know the one. You know the one.
Let's just treat yourself how you would a best friend, and treat a best friend how you would. That's how I
Yes.
roll in life.
Yes. What about other people that are not best friends?
Then I treat them how I would like them to treat me.
Aha.
If I
Makes
want them to be really nasty to me, I'll be really nasty to them first. I will throw the first. I'm going to get in there and be a piece of crap before they can be back to me. Just kidding. I'm actually all right with new people.
Anyway, I think we should start. Yeah.
I am just going to say there is a chance I may not be able to see the Q&A and stuff again.
That's fine.
Oh, no, wait. No, I can see it.
Woo!
I can see it. That is incredible. Thank you, teams. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
For people in the audience, my presentation is going to last some time, about 40 to 50 minutes. And at the end and throughout the entire talk, you can ask questions on the Q&A setting, which is the little question mark with a talk balloon thing. How do you describe that, Kat? Help me. You've got to lit English.
So, in the top right, on the sort of less dark coloured bar, it is the little question mark in a conversation bubble.
Yes, that's yes, exactly. So if you want to ask questions, throughout the talk and at the end, that's where you'll want to click. And I'm going to go straight ahead with the presentation. This is the second of our The Other Side series. This is something we've decided to do because we see a lot in people around us, a lot of disagreement and a lot of disrespect and a lot of misunderstandings that are unnecessary in our view. And they all stem from the fact that people nowadays don't listen to what other people have to say. And so people on different sides of controversial issues, shout their arguments without hearing any of the other contradicting arguments. And it's pretty much impossible to reach a consensus that way. And something we also see is that people on opposing sides of controversial issues often misrepresent grotesquely the people on the other side of the argument. And we really saw that in the 2016 election when Donald Trump was elected, and in the way that the left portrayed the Trump voters there as racists and homophobes and sexists and so on, instead of trying to understand why they voted the way they did. And it's never healthy to think that people we disagree with are crazy, because it dehumanizes them and makes it impossible to reach a consensus. And because we've noticed that around us, we decided to do The Other Side to showcase controversial issues and try as best as we can to speak about them in an unbiased manner, so that people can see all the sides of the issue, and that they're not crazy or evil, and that they've got issues to think the way they think and do what they do. And yes, today's The Other Side is going to be about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's going to be presented by me, André. I am the society's president, so if there's anything you need or want to talk about, about the society and so on, you can talk to anyone in the society, really. But yes, I am the person who is supposed to represent the society well. Anyway, I will get started, because this is quite long, with the history of Israel. Now, the first account of Israel in religious texts, namely the Torah and the Bible, is happened in Egypt, and it is stated in those religious texts that the Jewish people were slaves of the Egyptians. Now, at a certain point in time, the Pharaoh of Egypt decided to give the Jewish people freedom, and with that freedom, the Jewish people decided to migrate to the Promised Land. Now, the Promised Land is what they called the Kingdom of Israel in those religious texts, and what is nowadays Palestine and Israel. And they called it the Promised Land because, according to those religious texts, God promised the Jewish people that bit of land, what is today Israel and Palestine, and what they called the Kingdom of Israel. And so they went to that land, which they thought was theirs by divine right. And they stayed there for some time, and now we progress to more historical facts. We know that in a certain point in time, between 800 and 600 BC, the Jewish people that lived in that land that is today Israel and Palestine, they were basically kicked out of there by some other countries, some other empires which had different religions. And so because the Jewish people had conflicting religions, they were kicked out from that land. And so began the Jewish exile, which lasted for a very, very long time. And it caused the Jewish people that lived there to scatter across Middle East, across North Africa, and across Europe as well. And throughout the following centuries, you really saw that all the Jewish communities, mainly around Europe, really established themselves as academics, as bankers, as politicians in some instances as well, and really had a massive influence in how countries developed and evolved throughout the centuries. But despite this very central influence over what was happening around them, the Jewish communities were always ostracized pretty much wherever they were. They were always faced with discrimination, they were always persecuted, and one of the biggest examples of that is obviously the Inquisition, which existed in Portugal, where I'm from, and there was also the Spanish Inquisition. I think one of the best demonstrations of how important the Jewish communities were for those countries was that when the Portuguese Inquisition started, before that Portugal was really an up and coming country, really developing and doing well in all areas of economy, sciences, and so on. And when the Inquisition came to be in Portugal, the Jewish people fled to mainly Netherlands. And you really saw that from then on, there was a sort of stagnation in the evolution of Portugal, which just stopped evolving. And on the other side of the spectrum, the Netherlands saw a sharp rise in their development and how sort of in front of everyone else they were. And I think that's a very good demonstration of how important the Jewish people were in the countries they settled in. And yeah, that lasted pretty much until the 1900s, and throughout all these centuries, the Jewish communities were always faced with ostracization, a lot of persecution, and it really shaped what happened afterwards with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and so on. Now, moving on to the history of Palestine. Palestine was, throughout its history, since pretty much the Jewish people left that land, Palestine was its history is basically being conquered over and over again by different empires, and some of those are the Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Roman and Greek empires, the Arabic Empire, and finally the last one was the Ottoman Empire. Although the British Empire was also there for some time. But throughout their history, they were never independent, and they were always owned by someone. And something that's quite heartwarming about Palestine was that throughout their entire history, despite being always under someone else, and that someone else changed a lot, Palestine managed to really establish itself as a place where anyone could be, and where people of different origins live together in peace. And I think it's quite cool that throughout their history, despite those empires coming and going away, they managed to keep that side of being mostly peaceful, despite how multicultural the country was and how many different people there were there. It's because those empires were only temporary, and the Palestinian spirits, who they were, was kind of more eternal than those empires. But yeah, that brings us pretty much until the 1900s as well, and that was a brief overview of the separate history of Israel and Palestine. Now let's fast forward to the 20th century, which is where the history of this conflict starts. Now, it all starts with promises in the Balfour Declaration, but way before the Balfour Declaration, which was in 1916, I think, Napoleon in the early 1800s said to the Jewish people of Europe that they would soon own the land that is now Israel and Palestine, and would be able to form a country of their own there. This was in the early 1800s by Napoleon. And then if we skip 100 years to the future, we get to the First World War. And in around 1914, 1915, all the Arabic populations of countries like Egypt, Palestine, etc., sided with the British Empire in the First World War. Now, they were at the time owned, those countries, by the Ottoman Empire mostly, and so the fact that the Arabic population sided with the British Empire was quite significant. And so the British promised all those countries, including Palestine, that in as a sign of gratitude for their alliance with the British, that those countries would be given freedom and that they would be independent. And so you can see that for the Palestinians, they started hoping that they would soon be independent and be able to govern themselves. Now, a few years later, 1 or 2 years later, the Balfour Declaration happened. Now, Arthur Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of the British Empire at the time, and the declaration, the statement he made, said that the Jewish people of Europe would be very soon given the land that is now Israel and Palestine, would be given that land and would be able to form a country there and govern themselves. Now you can see the conflicting promises here made in a very short period of time, where on the one hand they promise the same land to both Palestine and Israel, the same bit of land promised to two sides, and that was really incorrect and caused a lot of a big mess really in that area. And so what this caused was for the Palestinian hopes of being independent to start rising, and the Israeli Jewish hopes of having their own country to start rising as well. And so this caused an increase in the influx of Jewish people from Europe to Palestine, because obviously they thought that they would very soon own that land and be able to form their own country. And so with the increased influx of Jewish people to Palestine, and obviously the Jewish people coming from Europe were mostly quite influential and with some money, because the Jewish people in Europe tended to be in the higher classes, let's put it that way. And so they came to Palestine, and they were obviously convinced that very soon that land would be theirs. And so I guess they adopted a posture that was seen as presumptuous by the Palestinians, who were starting to get worried, because they saw both the promises being made to the Jewish people of them having their own country very soon, and also foreseeing all these Jewish people come in. It made them nervous. It made them afraid that they were not going to get their freedom after all. And so tensions started rising between the Israeli and the Palestinian. And then with the Second World War happening, obviously the influx of Jewish people coming from Europe increased tremendously, and that only caused a rise in the tension between the Palestinians and the Jewish. Now, Britain wasn't able to control what was happening there, not even near. It wasn't even close to it. And so what ended up happening was that, despite having caused all this, the British Empire said, we'll just get out of there, and left the situation in the hands of the United Nations. And what the United Nations did was that in 1948, they decided to sign the Declaration of the State of Israel, which announced the creation of the State of Israel within certain boundaries, and the borders of Palestine were defined as well, with Jerusalem as a city with a special status, given its importance to both Jewish and Muslims. And so this was what was in the Declaration of the State of Israel. And what happened immediately the day at midnight on the day when the State of Israel started was that both Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries, so Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, they immediately launched an attack against Israel. And Israel responded in a very, very extreme manner, and ended up taking some bits of land that were supposed to be Palestine's after this war. Now, this was actually not in 1950, but in 1949, Israel reached a sort of peace agreement with Egypt and Jordan and the neighboring Arab countries, which signified that there was some kind of a peaceful period after this first Arab-Israeli war. Now, in the sequence of that a peace agreement, Egypt and Jordan were given parts of Palestine. And so Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip, Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Syria controlled a few bits at the north of Palestine, which means that the Palestinians that were supposed to gain their independence with the Declaration of the State of Israel didn't actually gain it, because they were controlled by the neighboring Arab countries. And so what this caused, together with the whole situation and the resentment towards Israel from both the Palestinians and the neighboring Arab countries, caused a lot of tension between all the sides, really, between Israel and Palestine, Israel and the neighboring Arab countries, and Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries. And so the years that followed, which were about 16, were filled with tension, with attacks here and there, but never open war. This was until 1967, when the Six-Day War happened. This was a very violent war, that happened between all the Arab countries around that land and Israel. And what ended up happening was that, you could say this is arguable, but I'd say that Israel won that war and conquered even more territory that was supposed to be Palestinian. The 6-Day War was followed by open conflict for quite a few years, with many attacks here and there between all the different sides. And in 1979, we started seeing some of the countries, some of the sides, reaching some sort of peace agreement. And so slowly Israel started making peace with Egypt, with Jordan, with Syria. And so slowly the situation progressed to be more and more peaceful. Now, although there was a lot of progress made with the neighboring Arab countries, there was never significant progress made in terms of making peace between Israel and Palestine. And so out of frustration and out of being in this situation for so long, the Palestinians started the first Intifada in 1987. And this was a series of massive protests all over the country against the situation they were in. And the first Intifada didn't last for very long, lasted for less than a year, but it was a massive demonstration that the Palestinian people didn't want to be in that situation, and that they wanted to see it over. They wanted to see it solved. And so this caused some good things with the Palestinian leaders and the Israeli leaders trying for some time, for quite a few years, to reach some kind of peace agreement, but it never came to be. And so with obviously the Palestinians seeing that, and the Israeli to some extent as well, seeing that they were really close to a peace agreement, but that it was never reached for various circumstances that were happening, this created a lot of tension again. Because they were getting really desperate. They saw the first Intifada as something that would, bring them peace and would show how willing they were to have peace. And then nothing happened in response to that. So there was a lot of tension building up from, about 1994, 95, when the peace agreement started to fail, until 2000. It was a buildup of tension, which culminated with the Second Intifada. Now, the Second Intifada was much more powerful and much more long-lasting than the first one. It lasted, on and off for about 5 years, and it was a massive demonstrations of how frustrated and fearful and frustrated. I've said frustrated, but how unhappy the Palestinian people were with the whole situation and with it not being fixed. And so, as I said, the Second Intifada finished around 2005, and nothing really happened after that in terms of making peace. You saw some quieting down after the Second Intifada was over, but that quickly stopped, and you started seeing attacks here and there. Never open conflict, but a lot of tension building up, and loads of attacks happening here and there, despite there not being an open conflict. And this is where we stand today. Now, this was, believe me, it might sound like it wasn't short at all, but it was a very short description of what happened. And there's a lot of details that I had to go through. It's really a very complex situation. But now I'm going to focus on some specific details. So first of all, I think it's important to talk about solutions. Now, there are two generally agreed upon solutions for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first one is a two-state solution, which is what was assumed in the declaration of the State of Israel by the UN, and it's, I think, generally the most widely wanted option for the resolution of this conflict. And I'd say it's the moderate option. And then you have the one-state solution, which has three flavors. You have the extremist Palestinian, which states that there will only be one country in that land, and it will be Palestine, and the Israeli people are going to be kicked out. You have the extremist Israeli, which states that there is only going to be one country in that land, and it's going to be Israel, and either the Palestinians are going to be kicked out of it, or they will be second-class citizens in an apartheid sort of philosophy. And then we have the moderate option, which is to have a mixed country where Palestinians and Israeli are able to live in peace. Now, the issue with the moderate one-state solution for the Israeli is that they are in a minority compared to the Palestinians. And so if there were to be a country, one country for both Palestine and Israel, this means that the whole purpose, the whole intention of having a Jewish country is completely defeated, because they're in a minority, so they don't have, they aren't able to control themselves, which was the intention behind starting the State of Israel. So these are the options there are for resolving the conflict. Now, I think it's important to also talk about the main actors throughout this conflict, and the first one is David Ben-Gurion. Now, if you fly to Israel and happen to land in Tel Aviv, you will land in the Ben-Gurion airport, and this shows you how important he was in the history of Israel. He was one of the main people behind the creation of the State of Israel, and he really pushed for it. And one of the main reasons why Israel was created. And he had a perspective on Palestinians and Arabs in general. He wanted the two-state solution for their situation, but he didn't really trust Palestinians and Arabs in general. And so, although he was kind of moderate, he had some kind of conflicting feelings towards the Arabs, which wasn't probably a good thing. The next main actor we have is the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which was started in the 60s. And it was really the main sort of organized movement which wanted to defend the Palestinian interests. And Yasser Arafat was the first leader of the, actually I think he wasn't the first, but he was one of probably the most influential leader of the PLO there ever was. And he led it for about, I think, 20 years, for quite a long time, and he made a very respectful push for there to be peace between Israel and Palestine. It was a very important person in this whole situation. Then we have the Black September, which was a terrorist group that wanted to defend the Palestinian rights, and they did many terrible things, and which weren't properly beneficial to the situation of Israel or Palestine. We have Hamas, who Black September happened around the 70s, the Hamas came to be around the 80s and 90s, and the Hamas came as an alternative to the PLO. Because the PLO at the time was more peaceful, very prone to peace and wanting a two-state solution, and Hamas, the people that started Hamas weren't happy with that position by the PLO, and so they started Hamas. Currently, the PLO controls the West Bank and Hamas controls the Gaza Strip, which creates a whole other layer of complexity because the PLO and Hamas are quite different, politically speaking. And so you've got a country that's divided in two and with two very different parties leading the two sides. There were some elections, the only elections that ever happened in Palestine and happened in 2006, and Hamas went supposedly won over the PLO, but these results are very contested. Now, the other figure that's quite important is Yitzhak Rabin. He was the Israeli Prime Minister during the 90s, and together with Arafat, he made a really considerable push towards the peace process with Palestine and between Israel and Palestine. And he was a very significant figure in all this. And finally, we have Benjamin Netanyahu. He was the Israeli Prime Minister until 4 or 5 months ago. He is not openly anti-Palestine, but throughout his mandate, throughout the time he was in power, loads of dreadful things, in my opinion, happened that could arguably be described as his fault. And so I'm not the biggest fan of him, and I think he, although he didn't worsen the situation much, arguably, he also didn't improve the situation, and that's regretful. Now, to move on to key events, because that period from 1917 or more like 1948 to pretty much the present is filled with different events, and it's really loads of stuff happening. So I tried to get the key events that happening throughout all that time to give you a general idea of the important things that happened. So first of all we have the first Arab-Israeli war, which happened was the one that happened when the State of Israel was announced, and on the day that the State of Israel began. And so this war and the announcement of the State of Israel caused the Al-Nakba. Now, the Al-Nakba was what the Palestinians call what happens in the sequence of the war and the announcement of the State of Israel. And what happened was that almost 1 million Palestinians became refugees. The reasons for this were mostly that Israel, when it came to be and was given the bits of land that they currently own, they kicked out the Palestinians from that land, and so that caused most of the refugees. And then also in the sequence of the war itself, houses were destroyed, villages were destroyed, and this caused some of the refugees as well. Now, in the sequence of this war, as I said, Egypt and Jordan were given control over some parts of Palestine, and this caused a lot of tension between the Palestinians and Egypt and Jordan mostly. And so the next thing that we have is the Six-Day War, which was in 1968, which I've described, had the consequence of Israel gaining even more of the land that was supposed to be Palestine's. And shortly after, a couple of years, the Sudan Arab Summit was the one in which most of the Arab countries in Middle East announced that they didn't accept the existence of the State of Israel, and this was something that made the Israelis quite angry, because it's basically a statement of war, pretty much. we also had later on the Palestinian attempts to overthrow Jordan leaders. So I put this here so that you see that there was a lot of bad feelings and resentment from Palestinians towards Jordan and Egypt, because they were supposed to be independent, but then as soon as they're given independence, some other Arab countries come over and take control. So there was a lot of resentment. And the group that was responsible for this attempt was the Black September, which also did the assassination of Israeli Olympians in the 1972 Munich Olympic Games, and they killed, I think, 11 athletes. And this was really shocking for, our sort of European community, because we still see that nowadays when things are far away. We don't think much of them, but as soon as they get closer to us, like terrorist attacks and so on, suddenly it's very scary and very shocking, and everyone's talking about it. And so the assassination of the Olympians had the effect of really attracting the attention of the European societies. Then we have the Yom Kippur War, which was a war between the Arab countries and Israel, which once again achieved pretty much nothing. This time around, Israel didn't really get much more land than it had before, I would say, fortunately. Then we have the 1978 PLO attack on Israel. Now, this is because at the beginning of its existence, the PLO did launch some terrorist attacks, while I'd say trying to figure out what exactly it stood for. And so in response to this attack, Israel retaliated, as it often does, in a very strong manner. Then later on, we have, in the 80s, we have the Lebanon invasion by Israel, which ended fairly quickly. In the 80s as well, we have something that was quite pleasant for the Palestinians, which was Jordan renouncing to the West Bank, and Egypt shortly after also renounced to the Gaza Strip. So this meant that the Palestinians were finally able to govern themselves and not be controlled by someone else. In the 80s as well, the Hamas began its terrorist activity, and something that was quite good and shows how different the Hamas and PLO are. For the first time, the PLO recognized the State of Israel. And this was something that was very important for the beginning of peace talks between Israel and Palestine. Later on in the 80s, we had the Ibrahimi Mosque massacre. So an American Israeli went into a mosque in the West Bank with a gun and killed all the people inside. And this was obviously quite a terrible thing, which was a bit of a setback in the peace talks. Also in the 80s, we saw that peace treaties were signed between Israel and Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which was quite a positive thing. And at the same time, there were some peace attempts with Palestine, and we had the Oslo Peace Accord, we had the Madrid Peace Accord, we had the second Oslo Peace Accord, which didn't go so well. And then something that was quite bad was that Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by people in Israel which didn't want to have peace with Palestine and didn't want a two-state solution. They didn't accept the existence of the state of Palestine. And so the people that came after Rabin were much less peace-prone. And the demonstration of that is that the summit that happened shortly after his assassination, the Camp David II summit, failed. And this was pretty much the end of peace talks between Israel and Palestine. And what happened afterwards, and starting in 2000 with the Intifada, was that there were years, pretty much 20 years of successive attacks on both sides. You had terrorist attacks. These were mainly towards Israel from Hamas. you had the assassination of political leaders on both Palestinian and Israeli soil, and there were also political leaders in the neighboring Arab countries that were assassinated as well. Israel attacked the West Bank and Gaza Strip several times. One of the good things that happened was that Israel finally withdrew from their troops from Gaza, so the Gaza Strip, so that was a very positive thing. Another thing was the West Bank fence was built, so despite in the declaration that created the State of Israel, despite West Bank being supposedly Palestinian, Israel started taking slowly more and more of West Bank to itself and built a fence so that the Palestinians wouldn't be able to go back to their houses. And one other event that was quite significant was the Benjamin Netanyahu declared that the capital city of Israel would be, from I think 2017 onwards, would be unified Jerusalem. And unified is a very important word here, because as I said, Jerusalem was to be a city with a special status to be shared between Israelis and Palestinians. So by saying that the capital city of Israel is unified Jerusalem, he basically said, we consider Israel to be ours, and we don't think you have a right to it. And this was something that was quite significant, and I don't think it helped the peace process at all. And then obviously the 2021 crisis, this was triggered by something that happened in Jerusalem. Some Palestinians were following some Ramadan traditions, and they were attacked by Israeli police, and this triggered a lot of anger there. And then at the same time in West Bank, the Israelis were taking more and more Palestinian lands and, evicting more and more Palestinians from their houses. And this whole thing, really caused a lot of anger and was, I'd say the final straw, and loads of Palestinians started protesting. The Israeli police responded in force in a very extreme manner. Attacks launched from Gaza to Israel. Israel obviously responded again in a very strong manner, and we saw what happened afterwards with the event, with the phenomenon of social media. We got to see very closely what was happening there. And we obviously saw all the arguments and all the campaigns that ensued. And one of the things we saw as well was that most people, took one of the sides of the question without really trying to understand what the other side was about. And a lot of barriers were built because of this, because people weren't able to look at the other side and look at their arguments and realize that maybe there is a bit of reason there. And it is the reason why we're doing this today, because of how divided society was because of this situation. And one of the other things that happened, which I find quite dreadful, was the election. So a good thing happened, which is Netanyahu wasn't able to form a majority, but a majority was formed by a coalition of a moderate left party and a moderate to far right party. And so the moderate left leader is going to lead is going to be the prime minister for 2 years, and then the moderate to far right leader is going to be the prime minister for 2 years as well. And the far right leader is the one with the most influence, with the most power, and he is overtly anti-Palestine. So I fear that bad things will happen from now on. I do think that Netanyahu was anti-Palestine despite not openly saying it. And so I don't think things will change much, but I was hoping for some kind of change towards a more peaceful approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And yeah, that is a very long overview of everything that's happened since the start of history and now. And now we'll move to my personal opinion, and that's me, and that photo of me is there because it's my opinion, so it's me. Anyway, I think that it was necessary after the Holocaust to create a Jewish country, a place where Jewish people could go and govern themselves without fearing, persecution, fearing being ostracized, like they had been all those centuries before. So I think it was really necessary, and I don't think it's their fault that they started going to what is today Israel and Palestine, because obviously promises were made on the side of the British, conflicting promises, and so I understand why the Jewish community started emigrating to Palestine. Now, I do understand the position of the Palestinians when the State of Israel was announced, because they were obviously promised that they would be finally independent, and suddenly they start seeing all these Jewish people coming in with a very presumptuous attitude of someone who thinks they will own that land very soon, and they obviously started being afraid that they wouldn't be independent, and suddenly, half their land is taken from them and given to these people that were settling in. So I do understand that they were angry, they were frustrated, and so I understand why they had such a strong reaction to the announcement of the State of Israel. I don't understand why the neighboring Arab countries intervened. You could argue that they wanted to help their Arab neighbors and wanted to make sure that Palestine was able to become independent and have the land that was theirs before. But I don't agree with that, because if that was the case, why did they stay in Palestine afterwards, controlling Palestinian land? I don't think it's possible to say that they were friendly towards Palestine, because what they did afterwards was awful, by staying in Palestine for pretty much 20 to 30 years, increasing even more the time that Palestine was under the control of different countries. And so I don't think it was justified for the neighboring Arab countries to do that. I think it was just out of hatred, out of intolerance towards the towards the Jewish people. So I don't think it was positive at all. I understand why the Israeli reacted so strongly to the attack launched by Palestine and the neighboring Arab countries, because obviously they dreamt about the moment when they would have their own state. They dreamt about it for a long time, and finally it happens, and immediately they were attacked by people around them. And so it's almost I see it as being out of despair, the reaction of responding very strongly, because they were afraid that it was going to be taken from them. They were frustrated that their situation was going to last even longer, and so they reacted very strongly to make a point immediately. So I understand that. What happened afterwards, the years of tension between all the countries involved was, not positive at all, I don't think, but it was natural given the situation. I think that the influence that the neighboring Arab countries had over that was unnecessary, and did a lot of bad things, but it happened. And then when we get to the 80s and the 90s, we see that Arafat and Rabin start actual steps towards peace, and start to actually speak to each other and begin a peace process. And it was something that was great to see that after so many years of conflict, that finally it looked like we were going to get peace between Palestine and Israel. And then obviously Rabin was assassinated. Arafat died 8 years later of natural causes, and this set the peace process back tremendously. And I think it was a dreadful thing. Now, what happened afterwards was that more extreme people with more extreme philosophies started leading the Israel and Palestine, and this had the effect of once again increasing the tension between the two countries. Now, I don't think it was unjustified by Israeli and Palestinian to vote for these more extreme people, because obviously they tried to get peace by voting in people like Rabin and Arafat, who promised to make peace with the other side, with each other, and finally solve the situation. And they were so close, and then it didn't happen for various circumstances. And so I understand that out of despair, people just wanted to see the situation solved, and voted for, they'd voted for people more on the left, more willing to reconcile with each other. That didn't work, so they went to the right and for people with more extreme philosophies. And I think this is very similar to what happened in Britain with Brexit, where, in 2019, 2020, everyone was just tired of everything that went on and just wanted it to be over with. And I think that's why Boris Johnson was elected, because he looked like the person most capable of getting it over with the quickest. And so people voted for him because they wanted the situation to be over with, no matter how. And so this was only after 4 years of Brexit. Imagine what it is like to be in a conflict for 50 years, and still not being any closer to peace between the two sides. So I really understand why people turned to more extreme right-wing people and parties. And then obviously the years in the noughties and the 2010s, it was some just tension, no peace process at all started by either side, no overt conflict between the sides either. So a bit of a stalemate, nothing really happening between the sides. And then what happened recently in 2021, the way the Israeli police treated and the Israeli authorities treated Palestinians in Jerusalem and West Bank is completely uncalled for in my position, in my opinion, and it had very dreadful effects. And I don't understand where it came from at all. And I think it shows as well that Benjamin Netanyahu was anti-Palestinian and was not, keen on a peace process between Israel and Palestine. And I think it was quite a dreadful thing. And finally, I think that the elections that followed were not positive at all. I'm afraid I was hoping that someone more peace-prone would be elected, but that didn't happen. And I'm a bit afraid of what's going to happen next. But yeah, that's my personal opinion on what exactly happened. It actually changed a bit before, after making this presentation and looking through the entire history and so on. It changed a bit. I think I'm not pro-Palestine nor pro-Israel now. And before making this presentation, I was slightly pro-Israel, but I think I'm completely neutral now. And I think both countries, both communities, both populations had reasons to act the way they did, and so I don't blame either of them for what happened. And one final thing that I really think it's important is that one thing I saw following the crisis earlier this year was that loads of people were blaming the entirety of the Israeli population or the entirety of the Palestinian population. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's right to do that. Those people elected their current political leaders out of despair, out of being, for 70 years stuck in the same situation, in the same conflict, never being able to live normal lives. And that's, I think, the election of those more extreme parties and people comes from all those years of the conflict. And ultimately the decisions that were made by the political leaders. As I said, Benjamin Netanyahu wasn't openly anti-Palestine. He wasn't elected based on his anti-Palestinian positions, but ultimately he did do things, very regretful things, that were undeniably anti-Palestinian. And so I don't think it's right to blame an entire country. I don't think it's right to blame an entire population. Blame the people, the leaders, the political leaders that are making the decisions. Don't blame the populations of the countries, because they are desperate, they are tired, and they just want to see their situation solved. And I could bet you my life that the majority of the population of either country doesn't want the other side to be attacked or be discriminated against or live unhappily. And that's the final point I wanted to leave you with. Don't blame the populations. Please, if you want to blame someone, blame the political leaders. And finally, a conclusion of everything I've said. Both Israel and Palestine claim to have a right to that land. Israel, from a sort of divine right, and having lived there, 2,600 years in the past. Palestine's claim comes from the fact that, all of the people, all of the Palestinian people before 1948 and their families before them for many centuries lived in that land. So that's where their claim comes from. Conflicting promises around the time of the First World War were thrown around by the British, which caused lots of tension and increased the influx of Israeli people towards Palestine. Later on, the announcement of the creation of the State of Israel caused the Arab-Israeli War, which caused, together with the creation of the State of Israel itself, the Al-Nakba. And Israel, in the sequence of this war, annexed part of the Palestinian land. And after the war, Egypt and Jordan, as decided in the 1949 peace agreement, kept control of different parts of Palestine, which was something that was arguably uncalled for and really detrimental to the Palestinians. Several decades with constant attacks, direct and indirect, between all the sides ensued. But slowly Israel managed to reconcile with neighboring Arab countries, but this never happened with Palestine, although Rabin and Arafat wanted peace and were very close to reaching it. But the deaths of both of them set the peace process back. The emergence of more extreme, less peace-prone politicians and groups and parties caused a further regress in the process. The problem was worsened even more by the interference of external governments and politicians, like Donald Trump, when he accepted and celebrated the fact that the unified Jerusalem was stated as the capital city of Israel. So the interference of these people and governments really worsened the situation. And finally, the escalation of violence in 2021 brought sudden attention to the conflict, created a lot of discussions between different people, a lot of misunderstandings, and that was the reason why we did it. We did this presentation, and I hope it's been an understandable, comprehensible, complete and unbiased account of what happened. I hope you now have a complete image of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I hope that with this information that I've given you, with the facts that I showcased, that you will now be able to understand both of the sides better and in more detail. And having said this, and I do apologize for taking so long, but it's a really complex issue, I am open to questions and comments. So if Kat, you could come in. Oh,
well, I have one from me.
Go on.
How do you think social media is playing into how politicians internationally have been responding to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Because a lot of the things that we've seen, for example, like Trump's actions and what he said online, and how people have then automatically turned against what he's said because it's Trump. And how do you think social media has played a role in dictating this?
I think it has. What it does is it exponentially affects things and makes things look bigger than they do. So, for example, you know, if you suddenly see that there was a very interesting experiment that was done in Portugal, where someone went out to the streets and asked people in the streets what they thought of social media controversies. And what they found was that no one in the streets knew about social media controversies. And what this shows for me is that you know, people take what's happening in social media in a very extreme manner, like it is what everyone in society thinks. And so if you think that something is what everyone in the society thinks, you're obviously going to act accordingly. I don't know whether that will have affected an issue like this one. Maybe in the case of Donald Trump, because he was he's not the conventional politician, but I think that for most cases, in for example in Europe, the decisions that were taken and the statements that were released by governments and by countries were largely determined by, you know, the socio-political situation and what the international community as a whole thought. So I think it did have some influence on the situation, but not much in this specific example.
That's an interesting direction.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What's your position on all this, if it's not putting you on the spot?
Honestly,
yes.
I don't really know. I think with anything like this, because
after I spent 1 hour.
Yeah, no. I'm getting there. I'm just very conflicted because it's dealing with different religion and cultural groups of people who want different things that essentially affect the same sort of areas, like the same areas of land. And you see, I think that there needs to be a point where the two countries can coexist with each other, where you don't have an underclass of a certain demographic based on their culture or their religion or where they're from. But the problem is, in the current state of the Middle East right now, it'll be really, really difficult, and I'm not really sure how Like, my viewpoint is I just want them all to just stop fighting each other over land and differences of belief, and just get to the point where they can just coexist and recognize that not everybody has to have the same beliefs. Or
I think it's easier for us because
oh, absolutely, that was going to be my next thing actually. Was how do you think international behaviors towards Israel and Palestine have changed the situation? Like, do you think international responses have driven it in a way, because of the fact that they have all of these? You have all of the countries like the USA, the UK, Europe, and that, where we all have our own very different views and ideas of how things are. And I'm wondering if you think that's had any sort of, do you think that internationally, that international countries and such should get involved and try and sort out the so-called goodies and the so-called baddies? Like, do you think international communities have any right to do that?
I think that, and the case of Afghanistan really shows that there's no point anymore in trying to be peacemakers. It's morally questionable whether we, I mean, you know, Europe and North America, it's very questionable that we should be acting as, you know, the moral compass of the world and the peacekeeper, really. And I think countries should be left on their own to solve their issues the way they want. And I think that the international community has taken the right position with Afghanistan. I think that the intervention that the US and the UK as well had in Afghanistan caused a lot of problems, the consequences of which we are seeing today. And I think that although it's painful now to see how much they've regressed in the country, I think ultimately in the long term it will be the better solution. So I don't think the international community should act on Israel and Palestine. Now, one of the things that's done is obviously statements are released, and you know, there are opinions on different sides, but I don't think these have make any difference whatsoever to mainly the Israeli, because the Palestinians, if you look at it from an objective point of view, although this is actually quite subjective, but I think they don't have much power here. They're just trying to survive, and Israel are the ones that are getting all the money from the US and that have all the influence from their beginnings and so on. And Israel just don't care. I mean, the international community has said several times that it considers the settlements in West Bank, the Israeli settlements in West Bank, to be illegal, and the things that are being done in Jerusalem to be illegal. And what Israel says, and they've got a legal point, is that Palestine was never a country, so therefore those are not crimes because Palestine isn't a country. And so pretty much all accusations are deflected in this manner. Palestine isn't a country, so this is not wrong, and it's such a ridiculous argument to make, and I don't think, unless the Israeli and Palestinian people decide to vote for people who don't do that, I don't think the people in power right now will ever change that attitude, because it's working for them. You know, they're in power, that they're making the decisions, and they're still being voted again and again. So I don't think that will ever change. It's sad.
Well, I have two more for you. You got the brain cogs turning. Was when you were talking about how people within Israel use the defense that Palestine is not a country. Do you agree with the statement that a country is not a place, it's an idea? And if so, how would you determine, or how do you think, like, that the international community, like, who should they listen to and recognize when groups of people are saying we are a country versus another group of people saying you're not a country?
Well, So I think this is something that should be ultimately up to the people, and it's something that I think that the Spanish government handled very badly with the Catalonian situation, where they just decided not to make a referendum, and the same thing is being done to some extent here in Scotland. Although you could argue that the first indie ref was in 2013, so that doesn't really make sense to have another referendum so close to the first one, but also the situation changed massively with Brexit and so on. But I do think that it should be ultimately up to the people. You know, if you're a government, you're supposed to be representing the people of the country you are leading, and so if some of those people want to have their own country, I think it's morally wrong, ethically wrong, to not allow them that possibility. And so I don't think you should give them independence straight away, but work towards, for example, with the referendum, towards independence, and seeing if everyone wants it. So I do think that the Palestinians deserve, it's their right to be a country and to not be controlled by someone else. But again, I don't think we have any right in interfering in that. I have my opinion on it, but I would never impose my opinion over Palestinians or Israeli. So, ultimately, there's no point to discussing anything because we have no influence whatsoever.
My second question is gonna be one of the, oh God, why did you ask that thing? So globalization, right? I can get on a plane, maybe not right this second, but I can get on a plane and I can fly to pretty much anywhere.
Not you personally.
I mean, I don't have, I wouldn't be just wanting to do it off the bat, but I mean, I could.
And what I'm saying is, you said you could fly anywhere, and I said, well, you yourself couldn't fly. It would be a pilot.
I would be inside a plane.
Yeah, okay? Yes.
I'm gonna ignore all of my little fears and issues with flying, but I could, in theory, get on a plane that's going anywhere. And the fact that we are so interconnected, you can get from one end of the globe right the way to the other in the space of like half a day or something, with a bit of time changing going on. So when you argue that the international community should stay out, is there not the second argument that the fact that there is globalization, people can travel wherever they want? And there's also the fact that airspace exists. And so what exactly happens when the international community either flies or travels through or over these countries that might actively be at war with each other? Do we have the right, like, should the international community, should we be allowed to utilize the globalization of all of us and just travel? And should the international community fight back if, say, for example, you get a plane that gets shot down over one of these countries, and should they take action? Because then you start getting the whole argument of citizens from XYZ country have been killed in a missile strike or whatever. Like, where do you start drawing lines because of how interconnected the world is? Is it actually in 2021? Is it in current year? Is it a logical and sustainable idea to sort of allow two nations essentially to get on with it themselves? because of the fact that we are so interconnected.
I think that if the whole thing starts impacting significantly the international community, then the international community does have a right to do something, or a moral duty to do something. Having said that, I think it's difficult to define when that moment is. For the specific example of flying on their airspace, is that the
Yeah, it was just because I was thinking about the fact that we're very interconnected. You will get people who move countries. You get people who
like
travel
me.
all over the place. Yeah, you also get people who travel to different countries. For example, if there's been mass disasters or there's actually a large number of people getting killed in countries which are actively at war, you will get people. You will get your international forensics and your sort of your legal and your anti-genocide sort of folk going in. You'll get your aid and your relief workers coming in. You get your people like Doctors Without Borders, healthcare professionals that will travel out to really difficult places. Yeah. And it just, whilst I was thinking through this, it reminded me of the flight that got shot down. Was it over Ukraine? Was it by the Russian military? They shot down a civilian plane.
Oh, I thought you
like
were talking about
or something. But it's an example of Russia, and it is Ukraine, isn't it? It was Russia and Ukraine they still do have a pretty rocky relationship, and when they were actively sort of like attacking each other and there was aggression on both sides, they had a flight that went over the top and it got shot down, and about 100 to 200 civilian people from various countries all over the world died. And it just sort of, I just remembered that as I was making my point on globalization, because it's so easy to travel now, and we can communicate with people who are at the opposite end of the globe as well. So
I think that there is a very fine line that separates helping and influencing. I think the international community should intervene in the sense of helping, with Doctors Without Borders, with the Red Cross and so on. But when the influence starts being more, when the presence there starts being more about influencing politics and military and so on, I think it's not correct to do it. Now, with the case of Russia and Ukraine, in an ideal world where the international community didn't care about the size of the countries and monetary power and so on, I think the international community would have acted on Russia, because it was, they killed civilians. It's not right. Yeah. But because of the size of Russia, because of the power of Russia, they didn't intervene, and it's the same thing in China.
I think they tried like the international courts to do with human rights and crime and such. They tried to take Putin and Russia to, basically they tried to take it to them that they had irrefutable evidence that it was a Russian missile. And Putin and essentially in Russia, as far as I'm aware, I could be wrong, they basically turned around and essentially did the whole, no, we didn't. That's not what our records say.
What do you mean?
Goodbye.
What?
Yeah, that's essentially what they did. So anything that they were told they had to do, they didn't do it, because I think partially because it's carried out by the UN. The UN does not have any military power behind it. It's for all of the human, like the rights charters and the guidance and the laws and such that they have, they don't have actual enforcement.
Yeah. It's the same thing in China, and I'm now just making sure that our YouTube video is blocked in China.
It's fine. Mine was already taken down and then put back up. It's fine. I can fight any YouTube takedown any day.
But China is undeniably a dictatorship. Now, is that assumed?
Defunded in China.
Sorry?
Defunded in China. No ad revenue. Goodbye.
Now, have you seen pretty much any country of the international community doing anything about China criticizing? Of course not, because China is powerful. And so it although we might have this view of the world and international community as being these wonderful, unicorns that make sure that everything is well with the world, that's not the truth. There's a lot of factors going on under everything else. Anyway, if that's everything, I think we've kept our audience long enough. There's still some people hanging around, which is quite surprising.
That's fine. And this is when you discover it's Paula on 3 accounts or something like that. And in which case, Paula, you've been outdone by me because of that. Question time was all on me.
What is it? There we go. I'm going to make myself. Why doesn't this work? Wait, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now I should, in principle, be able to. There we go. That's working. I just want to say for everyone that watched and everyone that might watch on our YouTube or listen on our podcast, thank you very much for watching. It was a pleasure to have you. It was a pleasure to speak about this issue, which, in my view, is very interesting. And we hope that it had the effect of nuancing your position and your view of this issue. That's all we want to achieve with this initiative. So thank you very much. Have a good night, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Goodbye.